This is the On Humans podcast with your host, Ilari Mäkelä. You don't have to be an expert in anthropology or archaeology to have heard the idea that how humans evolved was men hunted and women gathered. And this idea, which is associated with the very famous conference Man the Hunter in 1966 and a book by the same name, it makes a lot of sense at face value. I mean, the idea is that the human species flourished because we created this ingenious division of labor between the sexes. This division allowed women to focus on things like childcare, while also forage easily available food, while men were doing dangerous hunts and bringing in the meat. Now, this theory also did focus particularly on the male part of this. It was said that hunting really made humans who we are. Hunting required long-distance endurance, probably on two legs. It required complicated communication with whispers and shouts, in other words, language. And it required complicated teamwork. In other words, all of these kinds of things that make us such a particular ape. However, if only men were doing this, then there's a little bit of an issue, which is that women were passive recipients of these gifts in human evolution. An idea that not everyone is comfortable with doesn't mean that it's false, but definitely means that it should be investigated. And it was investigated indeed. This idea got a lot of pushback in the late 20th century. This pushback focused really on the ways in which foraging is often more important for calories than hunting in hunter-gatherer societies, and in ways in which foraging and childcare are super important for the evolution of human sociality. Books like Woman the Gatherer became influential, and I actually interviewed one of the legends of this strand of scholarship, Kristen Hawkes, in episode 6. Now, this is all interesting, but it does still assume that there is a strong division of labor between the sexes in human evolution. Again, not everybody likes this idea. Again, that doesn't mean that the idea is wrong. But again, we should investigate. Are we simply projecting our stereotypes onto the distant past when we assume this difference? Or is the opposite happening, as some claim? So when modern films portray prehistoric women as hunters, are they simply projecting our 21st century ideals onto the past? A couple of weeks ago, there was a high-profile Scientific American article on this, written by Dr. Sarah Lacey and Dr. Cara Ocobock. Now, the authors argued with great force that women too evolved to hunt, and we should, quote, bury man the hunter for good. This was a super interesting article, but as you might guess, it caused a bit of a stir on social media, and some of the heated controversy was of course predictable, but I am worried that the subtleties of the science can remain kind of hidden under the layer of politics. So I invited one of the authors, Cara Ocobock, on the show. Ocobock is a biological anthropologist, but also a powerlifter herself. So you can see where the interest comes from. And we had indeed a wonderful and wide-ranging discussion. It was not only rewarding because I understood the argument better after having this, but also because I think that we might have even gotten past some of the most unhelpful, unnecessary controversies. Indeed, I do think that it's very important to remember that there are kind of many possible arguments here. One is the argument that women did hunt. It would have been at all weird to see prehistoric women hunting. And then there is the much stronger claim that this would have been roughly 50-50, so that there was no, even percentage-wise, no sexual division of labor. These are two different claims. We go into this detail in the second half of the conversation if you are interested in it. But I just think that that's very important to keep in mind when talking about this with others, because people can often talk past each other. One of them is talking about the absolutes, another one about the percentages, etc. I do want to say, as always, that if you do like this and other episodes on the show, do make sure that you subscribe to the podcast and leave a review on whatever app you are using. If you want to become part of the inner circle of wonderful people who also support the show with real money, that would be amazing. Thank you so much for even considering it. If you do want to do it now, just head to patreon.com/onhumans, and you can pledge even a very small sum. Finally, I want to address one issue, which is that I know what it's like to listen to a fascinating podcast episode, want to share something about it with friends, but not be quite sure how to get the main point across. After all, they might not want to listen to the whole 90-minute episode, and you might have forgotten how all the fascinating anecdotes really fit together into an argument. Now, to help you in such situations, I have started writing a breakdown of each new conversation. You can read these mini essays on my Substack. That's going to be onhumans.substack.com, or even get them directly to your inbox if you want to. All the links that I mentioned here are included in the show notes. In the show notes, you will also find a list of names, technical terms that we mentioned in the conversation. Anyway, let's get back to the show. I bring to you Cara Ocobock. Dr. Cara Ocobock. Welcome to On Humans.
Thank you so much for having me on, Alara. It's great to be here.
I think a nice little story that could lead us to the topic of our conversation is the fossil discovery in 2018 on the Peruvian Andes. Would you like to start by just telling your version of what the archaeologists found, what they first thought, and what they discovered later?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'll be very clear that this is not my work, that I am not one of the archaeologists who found this site or excavate at this site. And I'm not an archaeologist at all. But these folks are working at a site that's about 11,000 years old in Peru. And they had several grave sites of multiple individuals. And with the bony remains, they also found several hunting implements. So the kinds of stone tools and hunting weapons you expect to find. And they had assumed that because these individuals were buried with hunting weaponry, that they must have been male, because there's this kind of long held belief that males were hunters, females were gatherers, and these very strict sexual division of labor. And so then they actually did the analysis on the bones themselves, and they found that almost half were female and not male. And so you had these female skeletons, or what we believe to be female skeletons, uh, buried with hunting weaponry, which is really strong evidence that females were doing the hunting as well as males. Because typically someone is not buried with tools or weaponry or any sort of grave good unless it was something used in life or incredibly important to that individual. And so this kind of turned this idea on the head of like it's only males doing the hunting, and no, it's not. Females are doing hunting as well.
And he had a great Scientific American article that came out just recently. You're starting from the same basic idea, right? That this is it looks like when we actually do the analysis, where we don't just open the grave, see hunting weapons, and say, "Aha, it must be men." When we actually do proper analysis, it more often than not, it turns out that probably females were doing hunting as well. And would it be right to say that there's kind of three strands of evidence for this? One from the archaeology of the past, one from anthropology of present, and third from physiology.
Correct. Yeah. Well summarized. Somebody did their homework for this interview.
Well, let's do this one by one. So archaeology. I could easily see someone say that the Peruvian findings are super interesting. They demonstrate the importance to actually do the genetic analysis. But in the large scheme, it's just an anecdote because it's just one site. So how common is it when we actually do know with pretty high confidence the biological sex of the remains? What kind of evidence do we have there about either this kind of evidence about hunting weapons or some secondary evidence which would suggest that there was no strong sexual division of labor, or that there was strong sexual division of labor? So when you look at the archaeological evidence, not just taking this one example, but kind of across the spectrum, what do we find?
Yeah, so we're going to look at a couple of different time points because there's no sharp dividing line between what is archaeology and, say, paleoanthropology, going a little bit into the deeper past. So, archaeological evidence, we have these wonderful findings like the Peruvian finding. And I think this will also end up leading to lots of other folks maybe reassessing their own archaeological sites to take a look at who was buried with what and how sure are we about sex estimation, which is kind of the more preferred term because even things still can be wrong when looking at the shape of the bones and sometimes even the genetics. You with ancient DNA, things get a little bit more tricky. And so we have this wonderful Peruvian example. We also have, it's not hunting per se, but we have Viking sites that clearly show females being buried as celebrated warriors. And so again, this idea that war, hunting, all these things that we today stereotypically assign to males, females were taking part in even the recent past.
I mean, the Viking example is very interesting, and I actually love I remember reading about it, and I love the details around it also. But that is quite recent in the big scheme of things. I mean, if we're focusing on especially hunter gatherers in the Pleistocene, so say well, more than 12,000
Exactly.
years ago. That's the Peruvian findings are right in the kind of, they're right in the cusp.
Yeah, they're the 11,000.
Yeah, so right in the beginning of whole thing, but kind of, close to that mythical
Yeah.
era. Vikings definitely not so super interesting, but less important.
They are not hunter gatherers. However, they're a wonderful example of the ways in which our preconceived notions about what individuals are buried with lead to a bias and how we are recreating what those individuals were like in their time when they were alive.
Yeah, because with the Vikings, they also thought that they found males, right?
Exactly, exactly. And so this is again one of those things that folks will likely be going back over some of their archaeological sites to make sure that they got that analysis right, and that they didn't just assign male because they were buried with hunting implements or war implements or things like that.
Yeah, it is quite a circular argument if you say that we have only found males to be hunting, because every time we find a hunting weapon, we say this man.
Exactly. Like you're proving it yourself without actually doing the analysis. But if we go deeper in time, let's go further back to say Neanderthals, who in some parts of the world were around 500,000 years ago and around as recently as 30,000 years ago. So they had a nice long lifespan on Earth. So Neanderthals are really interesting in that they were much more focused on big game hunting relative to anatomically modern humans, which came later after Neanderthals, and of course they all interbred. But they focused on big game hunting, and they did it in a way that was up close and personal with those big animals, likely involving spear thrusting and spear throwing. And because of that style of hunting, they got injured a lot.
Huh. I
The
can believe that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, the Neanderthal fossil record is filled with injuries.
Okay.
Like,
Okay.
yeah, like we see this. It's not just like us thinking that they must have gotten injured. No, we see injuries and healed injuries in the
Okay.
bones of Neanderthals. So we
Okay.
have strong evidence that they were injured all the time and it was likely related.
And by the way,
Hmm,
this is a bit tangential, but if they
yeah.
had a lot of healed injury, that does also tell us a lot about their sociality, probably. Because I mean, I had a really lovely chat about this with Jeremy De Silva, about how, especially once you're bipedal,
Hmm.
if you injure one of your legs, if you don't have friends, family, etc., taking care of you, you're not going to survive. And what's really fascinating is that we find, I think, even 2 million-year-old leg bones that have healed from fractures in the hominin
Hmm.
record. So there's been friends around for a long time. So yeah, I just wanted to put it there. Neanderthals probably not completely solitary, brutish beasts.
Oh no, even looking at the genetics that we do have for Neanderthals, they lived in small groups that seem to have some sort of fission fusion going on depending on the seasonality and resource availability. But to go back to your point that we actually have a humerus, which is an upper arm bone, from a Neanderthal where they were amputated on the arm from the elbow down.
They were amputated.
It was an amputation. You also see how the bone itself atrophied over time, which means they survived that injury long enough for it to completely heal
Wow.
and become atrophied. So, like, we have strong evidence of Neanderthal medicine that they must have had something to survive these injuries. But anyway, back to the point. So, the idea again is that Neanderthals focused on big game hunting and that they were doing it in this up close manner in which they got lots of injuries, which is the fun part of this, is very similar to the injury pattern we see among modern day rodeo clowns. The people who
Okay.
distract. Yeah.
Okay.
Isn't that the best thing? This is a paper written
That
by
is
my
funny.
old PhD advisor, and
Okay.
they looked at the injury patterns of Neanderthals and looked at injury patterns across like a bunch of professions, like football players and rodeo riders and rodeo clowns. And it turns out it was really similar to the rodeo clowns because their job is to get in the animal's way and protect the rider when the rider falls off the animal. So, so we have these injury patterns and that suggest a certain type of hunting behavior. And if you were expecting to see a big sexual division of labor between males and females, what would you expect the injury pattern then to be between males and females?
Well, I guess even without going into the specific, different.
Yeah, you would expect something different. You wouldn't expect to see the exact same injury patterns between male and female Neanderthals.
And probably if men were doing the hunting, you would expect them to have more injuries. Oh, the rodeo style.
Exactly. So here's the deal. There's no difference in injury patterns between female Neanderthals and male Neanderthals. They were all doing the same thing. They were all getting involved in the hunting. They were all getting involved in the tool making and the preparation of the meat and the skins afterwards. We see the exact same injury patterns, use patterns, like overuse patterns, same sort of dental wear because they use their teeth to help scrape skins,
Okay.
the hides of animals. They would hold one end in their mouth, hold the other one out. See if I can get here. Hold the other end out in their hand, and then scrape with this hand.
And that was enough wear and tear that we can
You
detect.
see it on the teeth.
Really?
Yeah, we see that actually on the teeth. You get this weird frontal pattern of wear on the
Okay.
front incisors.
And okay, fascinating. And you see that in male and female skeletons, same
Exactly. So we
frequency.
see the
Okay.
hunting injury patterns, and then we see the quote unquote domestic wear patterns, like preparing hides and things like that.
Okay, so that all I mean that's all very good evidence. Now the problem with that though is that if I remember correctly, with Homo sapiens, almost ironically, that does change, and you actually start seeing more sexual differences in the injury patterns. Am I right?
You are absolutely correct. So, one of the better bits of evidence that we have, and this is much more recent in time.
Okay. Yeah. Can we put some? Can we put some? I know that some listeners probably will find the dates or the years just to be confusing. I mean, I think that anyone can listen to this conversation and forget about the dates, but anyone who wants to then cross-reference this with other things, it's just useful to have a vague idea of where we are. So with the Neanderthals, we're talking about something like 50,000 years.
So, they've been around from 500,000 years ago to about 30,000 years ago.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
they were on Earth far longer than Homo sapiens have been on Earth at this point. So yeah, in the more recent times, so we're talking like, 20-ish thousand years ago sort of things, we start to see a bit of a difference in throwing, where we'll see thrower's elbow more often among males than females. However, we still get thrower's elbow among females.
Okay.
Yeah, so, things like throwing spears, throwing, slings, using the atlatl, which is a spear thrower. Those are all things where you might get thrower's elbow. However, we don't have a good way of detecting, say, bow and arrow use in the bones the way we thrower's elbow. Um, so we can't really say perhaps females were hunting. They were throwing because we do get thrower's elbow among females, more common among males.
How much more common? How much more common, by the way? Is it like 10 times more common or like 10% more common?
I do not have a number off the top of my
Okay.
head. I'd have to go
Okay.
back to the paper to take a look, sorry. I couldn't tell you the I couldn't tell you the title of any of my publications at this point, Ilari. Like, the things you just dump out of your brain. You're like, "Right, that's
Yeah.
done, move on to the next thing."
Well, I actually
Um,
now I'm sorry that I interrupted because you were saying something super important. So we do see that do throwing. We probably weren't doing it quite as much, but at the same time, we wouldn't know if they were doing compensating for this with more bow and arrow use.
Correct, or other styles of hunting. That is exactly correct. And the other thing to be aware of is that females at this time are still quite robust, meaning their bones demonstrate the fact that they were very muscular. They were still doing a lot of physical labor and a lot of intense work.
That's super interesting. I'm not expecting you to know the answer to this, but a huge question around this kind of deep past archaeology anthropology is how good of a model are modern day hunter gatherers for Pleistocene. Let's not attack the debate head on here. But do we know if the muscularity of modern day hunter gatherer females differs from what we predict from
Oh,
Pleistocene humans? Because that would be a very interesting kind of hard biology way.
yeah. I don't know. I don't know. I can say that overall, like just typical trends kind of across populations, is that we are less robust now than we were, 10, 11, 12,000. Yeah. Males too.
Who should we ask? Because I think this would be a super interesting thing to see.
You have to find somebody who has access to any sort of skeletal remains from modern day hunter gatherers, which are probably really hard to get a hold of.
Yes, for good reasons.
Yeah, for very good reasons. And so I honestly don't know the accessibility. I don't know museum collections or what people are willing to do. But
But could you do some predictions based on just like, you measure muscles, you
muscle
use some.
mass, yeah, we'd have to take a look, and you could even do like, CT scans to take a look at the bones and things like that.
I'm getting very excited. This could be one of the most one of the ways to use some hard data to answer this very question of how similar lifestyles are modern day hunter gatherers living.
Mhm.
But unfortunately, no answer today. Let's put that.
No answer, but I do wanna make a statement about it, and it's not so much the debate, is that, like, modern day hunter gatherers can give us some interesting information. But so many people, and this is academics and the public alike, treat them as if they haven't been evolving for the past, 200,000 years. And that's not true. They are not these living fossils frozen in time. Modern day hunter gatherers have been evolving just like the rest of us. And so to expect that there's going to be a one-to-one relationship between modern day hunter gatherers from, 100,000 years ago, that is not a realistic comparison.
Yeah, yeah. And I think we have to get back to that actually, because anthropology, ethnography does play a role in your argument also. So then we have to look at it critically. But let's do that when we get there. So far, the situation, if I get it right, is first of all, we have this Peruvian example just demonstrating that no, we shouldn't expect that females weren't doing hunting.
Mhm.
The Neanderthal record really suggests that it's even stronger. It almost suggests now that they were doing exactly the same things. By the way, vice versa, meaning that probably the males in Neanderthal colonies were doing all the physical aspects, at least, of quote unquote women's work, whether that was
Yeah.
whatever we would say that it is. Then we have the little hiccup in the story, which is that we do find sexual differences in injury patterns in quite recent, though. You said only 20,000.
It's more recent, yeah, it is much more recent than the Neanderthals, and it's when throwing style weapons become more common.
Yes, yes, but there we have the big caveat, which is, and if I might add something to what we already said, in the biological differences in upper body strength is, I don't know how uncontroversial this is to say, or if this is at all controversial, but I mean, upper body strength is something where males tend to have a huge advantage.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
And then it would make sense for sure that bow and arrow would be the tools of choice.
Yeah, or the atlatl, which is the spear thrower, that also helps to kinda level the playing field on strength as well.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Well, so is there anything you want to add to the archaeology?
No, especially because that's not my expertise. I'm always like, when people wanna ask me the archaeology questions, like, that's why Sarah and I wrote them together because that's her area.
Let's then look at what is your area. The archaeology one is fascinating. The anthropology stuff is super difficult. We already hinted at the difficulties ahead in that.
Mm.
The physiology one is something which I think everyone will learn something interesting from, even if they don't care about this this issue. So I'd love to ask a couple of questions. But before we dig into it, let's just try to make sense of why it really matters for this question. So why don't you give your kind of take on it? When we think about these differences, like what I just mentioned, upper body strength being, males having an advantage in it, etc. When we think about these kind of physiological differences, how do they contribute to the debate about whether there was sexual division of labor?
So I think the really big issue here is that there's this assumed female physical inferiority because of this idea of the lesser upper body strength and things like that, that females would have been physically incapable of taking part in things like big game hunting or even small game hunting, on top of the concerns of menstruation, pregnancy, lactation, and child rearing. You can't get past the fact that a female has to carry a pregnancy for 9-ish months, depending, and you can't get past the fact that there's lactation. What we can tackle with this is that those do not stop an individual from taking part in regular activities because they kind of can't in our evolutionary past. You don't see any other mammals stopping, like they don't just not eat, they don't just not hunt, they don't just not run away from predators because they've got a baby or they're pregnant. They have to do that in order to survive. And so using the physiological and anatomical evidence is to lay out the argument that one, there isn't this innate physical inferiority that females suffer from. That's one. Two, females actually might have an advantage in certain respects. And three, pregnancy and lactation slash child rearing are not a handicap, which is the way so many people view it. That is why these things are put together in the physiological aspect, is kind of tying those three together to tear down these ideas that have driven the narrative for so long.
And so, just to be clear, it's the argument here is not that there are no interesting biological differences. Actually, quite the opposite, there are, but the way that they work out is definitely not as well as clear cut as we have tended to think, and not always even in favor of male physical performance. Is that right?
That's exactly it. It's the male physical superiority or supposed superiority that always gets the attention, and the other side of the coin is never really looked at.
And I think, and what is interesting is that it's not so much that you're not so much claiming. It seems that things like testosterone don't help things like strength, power, especially upper body strength, but that there is the other side of the coin of how things like estrogen also help in certain kinds of physical activity. So why don't you give the kind of estrogen pitch? What is this performance benefit of estrogen?
Like, estrogen is the most ignored hormone, and it upsets me to no end. And it's actually like an evolutionary reason of why it upsets me that people don't pay attention to it. So, some relatively recent work was trying to figure out what was the first steroid hormone. So, steroid hormones are things like testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. And that you can't actually date when a hormone appeared, but you can date based on genetics. You can date when a receptor for that hormone appeared, because that's what the cells produce, that they will produce the receptors to pick up that hormone signal. So you can actually try to come up with when this receptor first appeared. The estrogen receptor was the first one to appear. And the date for that is somewhere between 600 million and 1.2 billion years ago.
Wait, 600 million would be like 10 times more than dinosaur extinction. So that's very old. Okay.
And as potentially as old as 1.2 billion.
I don't even know what happened then.
Yeah, you can't comprehend that.
Yeah.
But it means the estrogen receptor predates sexual reproduction. So if it's at that older age, it predates sexual reproduction, which means estrogen has been a critical part of life forming on this planet and the way it has well before any other hormone was becoming biologically active.
Before any other hormone that we know.
So the testosterone receptor came about as a duplication of the estrogen receptor. So all other hormone, or I should say steroid hormone receptors, came from the original estrogen receptor. So estrogen was one, and then everything else branched off of it later. So the testosterone receptor is dated from 300 million to 600 million.
Okay, so estrogen is the mother of all hormones.
It is. It totally is. And I don't even want to call it the mother of hormones. We can gender it if we like, because all bodies need estrogen to survive. So I'm sure folks listening have heard of androgen insensitivity disorder. And these are individuals who produce testosterone, but their body doesn't make the receptors that can pick up on the testosterone signals. And though it's not common, these people are perfectly healthy. There will be reproductive health issues, and as in they likely will not be able to get pregnant or produce sperm or eggs or anything like that. But everything else is completely normal and healthy. What you don't see is estrogen insensitivity disorder.
Okay, because they wouldn't be around. Is that why?
Right? So there are 3 different kinds of estrogen. There are multiple forms of estrogen receptors. And there have been 3 cases of one form of estrogen receptor insensitivity. And all of these individuals, of which, again, 3 individuals, suffer pretty ill health effects. And you do not see estrogen insensitivity for any of the other receptors. And so the going, no one has actually proposed this. This is a thing that I've been toying with in my mind. Nobody's actually proposed this in the literature yet. But my thought is without some of these key estrogen receptors, like, it would be incompatible with life to not have these estrogen receptors. So this is why it annoys me that people ignore estrogen. It is the first one, and it has so many important implications of how our bodies function. no matter what your sex is.
Okay, so estrogen is super important, fascinating, and needs more focus. Relevance to our discussion, though, is that even if both males and female bodies produce estrogen, female bodies, am I right that they produce more, or they have more receptors, or both?
Both. Yeah, they produce more and they have more receptors as
Okay,
well.
okay.
Correct.
And estrogen not typically thought of as a sports steroid.
I know, which is outrageous. Although a few people have been caught using estrogen now as a performance enhancing drug.
Okay, and what kind of performance does it improve? Because it does not improve. Say you wanna increase your bench press. You shouldn't probably.
Correct. So, well, yes and no. Yes and no, because no one's ever actually studied this. So that's why I'm being a little wishy washy with my answer. Because one of the things estrogen does, or at least so it seems, is it protects cells from damage that can occur during exercise. And so that is something with, say, bench press and, any sort of power or strength sport. Reducing the amount of cell damage might be a good thing for you. And estrogen can also delay fatigue, and so you can get more reps out.
But I think this is super important. So this is important. So would it? So is the kind of quick pitch? Is it too simplified to say that where testosterone would increase your maximum capacity, estrogen would increase your stamina, your capacity to endure with a lower than a maximum capacity for longer?
That's kind of how it seems. Yeah.
Okay.
And it also improves the after effects. So, like, less damage, improved recovery.
And that's why the longer the running distance, the less there is sexual difference, to the extent that it might even flip after. What this is so really interesting, and it's such a shame. It was kind of, there are some suggestions that it's right after the marathon distance, something like 56 meters.
Yeah. Only one paper has modeled it and they put it at 60 kilometers, but like that's one paper. It would be great to study this far more. But in the ultra endurance events, we are seeing women win with much greater regularity, especially given how low their participation is relative to men at this point still. But we're seeing females win kind of, the Montaigne spine race and things like that. And so part of it is it reduces the fatigue, but what's leading to that reduced fatigue is estrogen increases the amount of fat muscles will burn to do activity. And fat gives you more calories per gram of it, which means you get longer, slower calorie burn, which can help you go further and it can delay fatigue. It also helps spare muscle mass if you run out of carbohydrate storage, which is stored in your muscles and in your liver.
So those sports gels would be more needed for males.
Yeah, I wondered. That would also be a really awesome study too. I mean, the thing is females are so understudied in exercise physiology that there are so many. Everything that we wrote in those papers could immediately be overturned eventually, but we're going on the data we currently have, even though it's a bit sparse.
Yes, I see. And I do remember seeing a study where they had men and women participants doing at a certain percentage of their maximum capacity. And although women would typically have lower maximum capacity, they were better at doing, say, you have to lift weights at 30% of your maximum capacity. They could lift many more repetitions than the men participants, at least on average. Yeah. So that would all feed into the same story. But what about things like Tour de France? I mean, if this is correct, I would expect there to be a massive female advantage in things like Tour de France, where you just keep going.
There should be. I mean, over time, there absolutely should be. I would love to take a look at some of the numbers to see where things are at. Participation still is not as high as we see among males. And the Tour de France is also interesting in the way that it paces you by days as well, but that would still be considered an ultra event.
But because the one reason I'm confused about this is that no matter how many fancy words we are gonna drop into this conversation, the very rapid reaction that people end up having to questions about sexual differences in sports is they just look at what's happening in actual sports. And nowadays, when we don't have, we might have lower participation, we might have some other obstacles. We don't have the kind of, in the 70s, it was almost unheard of, and it was thought that women shouldn't run a marathon.
Mm-hmm.
And we've come so far away from it. My friends who run, they often have like little bit more men and women in their
Hmm.
running clubs, but it's not. It's just no. It's not. It's not like there are no women runners anymore
Yeah,
or women cyclists. And in most sports, there is still male advantage. And so, what is your take on it?
I have an answer. I do have an answer for it, and I'm sure some people who are, very strict about it are not going to like the answer. But there are two things going on here. One is the lack of representation, that we still don't have parity, and we still don't have, and not only participation numbers, but in resources, as well as the socialization of how many young girls are pushed into sports uh, relative to boys. And why in the world do we have under six soccer, sorry, football, for those who are listening, under six football here in the United States? Why are we separating boys from girls at age six? Like, this is the most absurd thing. Anyway, but as for the biological things, I think one of the biggest caveats, and this is, again, it's going to be unsatisfying, is that all of our training, nutrition, and recovery plans and regimens are based on data collected from males. And it is just scaled down, treating females as small males. So we have no idea, because there are innate biological differences on average. I mean, there's always going to be overlap between two groups if we're keeping two strict box groups, which I don't necessarily agree with.
Are there in? I've understood that in things like testosterone levels, there really isn't that even the very low testosterone males have more testosterone in their
They
bloodstream.
do, but there's gonna be high testosterone. It gets close on some of them, for sure, it does. But even the correlation between testosterone and certain sports performances is not as strong as people like to think. There's a lot of individual variation. Um, but when we try to treat females like small males when it comes to any sort of exercise physiology and athletic training, are we actually optimizing female performance? Because there are some biological differences, say in the estrogen levels and the testosterone levels, or say in recovery and whatnot, we likely have not optimized female performance at all because we haven't studied the ways in which we should. And so I am more than happy to change my mind when we actually reach parity on the research. Like, right, we have fine tuned female athletic performance training, recovery, and nutrition now. Let's see what the data is. And if the data still separates out, great. Then the data still separates out, and we can rethink of how we're actually approaching this.
And in maximum strength, a bench press, we probably wouldn't. You're probably predicting that no parity.
Probably not. But like marathon, I mean, we'll see what happens. But until we are actually focused on optimizing female performance, then no, it's not a fair comparison to make. And it becomes one of those gotcha moments. You know how many times I've been sent average marathon times from people like in the past 2 weeks? Like that's what they immediately go to, but they don't really understand what's behind it. And the fact that ultra marathons kind of put females in a different class.
Well, this is all super interesting, and I love the humbleness. We have to wait for the data, so let's hope that people like you get funding.
And please prove me wrong. Like, everybody go and get your PhD in exercise physiology and study female performance, and then you can prove me wrong if that's your goal. Please do it. But I mean, it's also really hard. I mean, it's hard to get the funding to do studies right, if I'm being honest. Like, if we take females, for example, one of the big reasons why studies on females, and particularly looking at hormones, are usually terrible is because they cost so much money to do right. Like, if you want to see how athletic performance varies on the menstrual cycle, the way to do it is to actually measure hormones throughout the menstrual cycle. But that's crazy expensive to get that many days of hormone samples and analyze it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, one final thing before we return to the more general question about the human past is how much are these things about? So take the testosterone that we know more about. How much does it matter whether you have testosterone now as an athlete versus during your puberty?
Yeah, we don't know. And I mean, that's a hugely important question as we grapple with the inclusion and exclusion of transgender athletes, particularly transgender women athletes. Those are the ones that are being attacked the most right now in the United States. And we don't know. So that is an argument that people who want to exclude transgender athletes that they use often, like, oh, you went through puberty, therefore, you should not compete against females who were born and assigned female at birth. I'm not convinced yet. And until I actually, and I'm not sure if we're ever going to get enough data, if I'm honest with you. So in the United States, so I'm sorry, I have to use United States data because this is what I know. Only 0.6% of the population is thought to be transgender. How many of those are actually going to undergo transition? How many of them are actually athletes? And then how many within each sport? So when you think about doing the research, the numbers game is just against you in, in getting, the right amount of data. I mean, there's one study like looking at, I think, is it eight runners, and they looked at pre-transition running times and post-transition running times, and the results are all over the map. Some people got worse, some people got better after transitioning from male to female because they were mentally in a better place and felt better about themselves. And others got worse. So the data currently is very sparse and it's all over the map. And again, this is another place where I'm happy to be proven wrong at some point, that if we get the data and it says, no, absolutely, transgender women have this completely unavoidable advantage over cisgendered women, then right, then we could talk about ways in which we can include them in sports that is fair and equitable. But excluding people based on what you think and not what the data says right now, that's just causing harm. And to also state that including transgender athletes is harming women in general, excuse my language, but that's just bullshit. You're saying it's harming women's sports, but the people claiming this are people who have never supported women's sports to begin with. They are not out there donating to women's sports. They're not out there going to WNBA games. They're not doing these things. They're just, it becomes a battle cry to upset other people and rile it up. But they haven't cared about women's sports until this moment. So I don't want to hear that argument.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's try to summarize the main take-home message. Am I getting it right that the idea that men do the hunting, women do the gathering, and this goes forever back, it can come from a variety of sources? One is it can come from bad archaeology, you would say, or it can come just from the idea that, well, how could women possibly do it? Look, they can't even run a marathon, would have been the argument in the 60s. And now we both know that they can. And you're saying that actually when it comes to very long distance endurance sports, which might be very relevant to ancient hunting, it might be that it's not even that the female body is capable of this, might even be in some cases better at it than the male body. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, there is absolutely no reason, biologically speaking, of why females couldn't or shouldn't have been doing the hunting. And yeah, we can go back archaeologically. We can look at ethnography of recent and historical populations. We do see female hunters. Um, and then we can look at it biologically as well. And I think another key point, two key points to remember is, one, early human groups and early Neanderthal groups, they lived in small groups of people. These were not big populations. There weren't enough people to be specializing in different tasks. Everyone kind of had to be, as somebody said the other day, all hands on deck, because there just weren't enough of you to specialize. If you needed to go take down big game, and you needed everyone.
That is such an interesting point. I mean, I remember that was one of my favorite moments from your, I think it was maybe from the Scientific American article that you wrote, was this point about when you live in a relatively harsh environment in a small group, people just kind of analytically, it would make no sense to have a really strict prohibition in one group member helping with the activity of the others.
And we really don't see strong sexual division of labor until agriculture becomes predominant within various human civilizations. And so, yeah, it's applying stereotypes of today into the past without really having the data for it.
Well, okay, but then let's look at the data that is most, that where we do have a lot of data and where the data is the most. Because I mean, it's not true that the only reason we might think that men did hunting is patriarchal biases, because there is a lot of data from, like you mentioned, ethnography earlier, and we already mentioned it much earlier, suggesting we're going to come back to it. Very tricky topic, very difficult to say what exactly we can learn from modern day hunter-gatherers. But so far, I think everything we've said has been hopefully convincing about the claim that everybody is able to hunt and probably sometimes did. But then the question is about numbers, because I think most anthropologists who work around this theme would agree that sometimes females hunt. But they would say that, and you see this in papers all the time, that they say that overwhelmingly the majority of hunting is done by males, or men do most of the hunting, or whatever variation on this theme. And when we look at the numbers, the ethnographic sample is kind of becomes a really important source of data. So why don't you start with your take on this? Because this is where I think most people would fall back on and say, no, we actually have data on it being relatively rare that females/women hunt. And it comes from studies on modern day hunter-gatherers where, yes, they hunt sometimes, but not very often. So what's your take on that?
So my take on that is going to refer to a different Cara, not me, Dr. Cara Walscheffler. She and a couple of her students came out with a paper this past summer where they actually took a deep dive into an ethnographic database. And I will be fully forthright and say that some people have come out against this paper because of the way that they broke down the data in that database. So they looked for ethnographies that explicitly mentioned hunting and explicitly mentioned who was hunting. And so then they ignored any cases where they couldn't get the data on explicitly who was hunting. So that, of course, shrunk the sample size down a fair amount. And when they looked at the data of, I can't remember how many it was, 60 some or 70 some different populations.
I actually have the data in front of me. It was 65 groups, out of which almost 80% of the groups had some documentation of women hunting.
Exactly.
41 societies had data on whether hunting was intentional or opportunistic. It was almost always intentional in 87% of the time. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of numbers in here. There's a lot of numbers, but basically, yes, in the overwhelming majority of the cases, there were women.
And so, I mean, that's the thing. Is so this paper came out and like, hey, here are these 65 populations or 50 populations or whatever, and 80% of them show women were hunting. That's a big deal. That's a large number. Granted, anyone can come back and say, well, look at the way that you brought down the data set. But if no one explicitly states who is doing the hunting, how can you analyze who is doing the hunting from those ethnographies? Somebody could assume that males were doing it, but until you actually know with the explicit documentation of it, we aren't sure. I wouldn't be surprised if males ended up dominating it once you broaden things out. But again, this is one of those things that the ethnography is there. We do have lots and lots and lots of documentation of females hunting, and we see it with Trobriand Islanders. We see it with the Agta. And so it's just one of these things of people get upset because I think they are trying to claim that we are replacing man the hunter with woman the hunter. That like it's a complete replacement. It was either or a majority done by women. And that is, we never say that anywhere in any of the articles we have written. And we also explicitly say that overall, this is also population dependent. Hunting is not that important when it comes to how much food you're consuming. This, of course, changes for high latitude populations.
Yeah, like the Inuit.
Exactly. But unless you're one of those populations, you are getting far more small mammals, plant matter, trapping, fishing. Fishing is hugely important. And for some reason, fishing is not considered hunting. I don't know why that's defined differently, but it is. And so hunting in the grand scheme of things is not this critically hugely important source of calories. It does provide important calories when it does, but it's not always successful, it's not consistent, and it is not the main source of calories. And so I think this is where people get kind of caught up in this gut reaction to the headlines of this work, is that they think, you're just trying to make it seem like females are better than males and they're replacing males and all these things. Like, no, never do we say that anywhere ever.
Yes, I can fully confirm that I have never read you or your colleagues say that.
And so it's frustrating. And so we have all of these examples ethnographically, archaeologically, and the biological evidence as well that there is no reason why females weren't doing similar tasks as males. And then the relative ratio is going to be dependent from group of people to group of people. Um, but however, to claim that hunting is the key driving force of human evolution and males were doing the hunting, therefore evolution was acting upon males and females were these passive beneficiaries to it, that's where we cry foul. Like that is not correct in so many ways. And the hope is that these papers highlight the reasons why. And it's likely in some ways that females were a driving force in evolution because females are the bottleneck when it comes to pregnancy and offspring from one generation to the next.
Yeah, I would like to say two things. One to support that, and one to push back. The one thing to support is that I think there was even one Australian hunter-gatherer group. I think it's called the Martu, or Martu of Australia, where the amount of meat brought in by the female hunters was bigger on average than the meat brought in by the male hunters.
And so this also becomes the other part of the argument is that people be like, well, yeah, females were hunting, but it's rare. It's rare within this short time span. But when we're talking about 200,000 years of anatomically modern humans and then 500,000 years if we're including Neanderthals, who is to say that this short time span is representative of how things were in the past?
Well, hold on a second. This is really important. What do you mean by this short time span?
So when I'm talking about the ethnography, that's recent. That's within, the Industrial Revolution. That's a really short time span of very, honestly, relatively modern populations. And so it's, we can do the best we can with what we have with fossil evidence. And it's always hard to get behavior from fossil evidence. But at the moment, people are, a common comment is saying like, well, prove females were hunters. I'm like, well, prove it was only males hunting. 200,000 and you absolutely can't. And so they just assume that's the evidence, that the evidence points to males hunting.
No, I think that's a really fair point, is that even people who might disagree with parts of this argument could agree with the pushback saying that we should change the starting point.
Mm-hmm. The starting point should be no division of labor, and then prove it wrong with the data. Don't assume that it's males doing it. Yeah.
Well, fair enough. I mean, I did say that I'm going to skip 2 points. One of the to support and one as a pushback. So the pushback was, and you already hinted at it, is that this paper that we just discussed, which came out this summer, really interesting and definitely shaped my thinking. I mean, I was a different thinker around this topic before and after. So big thumbs up. However, there is one really frustrating lack in the paper, which is that it's a binary yes or no. It's a yes, women hunt, no, women don't hunt. Or yes, women hunt intentionally. Yes, they hunt, but only opportunistically. And no, they don't hunt. And then they do analyze it via, do they hunt big game or small game? And by the way, I've seen, for example, on Reddit, people say that, oh, yes, women hunt, but only small things like frogs or whatever. No, it was like in 33% of these groups. It was big game also. So that's all good. However, yeah, you don't see any data on, does this mean that there was, one observation of women hunting versus it was around 50?
I can't tell you that. Yeah, because that is not the data that I worked with. I would say get Cara on the show to talk about it. I mean, we're also constrained in what the ethnographies themselves contain, if they actually have that level of granularity in the data or not. That is not my data that I worked with. Yeah.
But there are papers who do suggest it. I mean, there is, Frank Marlowe is one of the kind of
big names in that.
Yeah, big names experts on hunter-gatherers. I don't know how much you disagree with Marlowe's work, but I have seen a paper from him, I think it was 2009 paper, where he tries to do exactly that. So he, and I think that he's just a really good example of why I think that there are kind of two different audiences that you are talking to, because on the one hand, you have the audience saying that basically I'm a woman can't.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the case is well made. I know they can, and they probably did. But then you have people like Frank Marlowe, who does very, very careful analysis, trying to make predictions on how much sexual division of labor there is. I think what he does is he goes through the whole, he at least suggests that he goes through the whole record of studied hunter-gatherer ethnographies and tries to put numbers on the level of sexual division of labor and see how much these correlate with this or that. And I can send this paper to you. I don't expect that you have read it yesterday. Remember everything. So we don't need to get to the nitty-gritty details. I'll also post it in the show notes. But the basic take-home message is that there is a curve going from vegetables and foods where it's not only women doing it, but it's majority, all the way to big sea hunting, like sea mammal hunting, where it's almost exclusively in all the samples, it's only men doing it. And then in the middle, you have things like hunting fowl birds, where it's majority men, but not always. And so I'm wondering, do you think that there is, so if you're not presented with this kind of caricature, females can hunt, women they should just do the foraging, but you're presented with a very careful analysis by someone like Frank Marlowe suggesting that, no, that there is sexual division of labor, but it's a question of percentages, not of absolutes. How much do you think there would be disagreement between you? And I don't want to take Frank Marlowe specifically, but someone like him who would make that kind of more granular claim. Do you think that there is disagreement?
I honestly don't think it is in opposition to what we're saying, because again, we're not saying that only females hunted or that even females did the majority of the hunting. What we are saying is that evolutionarily, in our deep past, there is no evidence of that deep sexual division of labor. And so when we reconstruct Neanderthals, early anatomically modern humans, even Homo erectus, these reconstructions of only males doing the hunting and females only doing the domestic duties, that's incorrect. So I don't dispute Marlowe. Marlowe did good work. He did good work on the data. I might dispute some interpretations here and there, but I'm absolutely fine with there being a sexual division of labor. I am not fine with it being an elimination version of sexual division of labor, that there is none of this crossover.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And I think that personally, if I think, what have I really learned about this, all the numbers aside, it's that, well, humans are pretty flexible.
Right. That is why we are so successful.
Yes. So it's probably not the case that wherever you go, you would always get the same kind of rigid difference.
No. I mean, our environments aren't the same wherever you go. And so wherever you are locally living and dealing with, you're going to deal with that situation and be flexible so you can survive and have kids on to the next generation.
Yeah. Well, another thing, I really appreciate that was a measured take on this. I wonder, have you by any chance, I so wish I would have sent this to you beforehand, actually, because I just remembered this morning that I've done an episode with Vivek Venkatraman, who works in very, very similar things.
Vivek is not happy with that Cara Walscheffler article. He's been very vocal about that one. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I did not know that, actually. Well, yeah. I need to see what he says.
He doesn't like how much the sample size has been shrunk down, but I see why the Walscheffler lab did that, because they were looking for explicit mentions of it so they could actually draw data from it.
Okay. Well, I think that the interesting thing here is we have been talking about doing another episode with him about another topic, but also this topic, because he has written a piece for The Conversation about the Peruvian finding. And it was a very, very interesting article, and it took a very interestingly different take, at least superficially, than you. Because what he argued was that the Peruvian finding, that there were female skeletons buried with weapons, hunting weapons, shouldn't be surprising at all.
It shouldn't be. I agree. It shouldn't be, but it is.
Yes, I agree. But here's where the difference comes. Is that he says that it absolutely shouldn't be surprising because of what we just said earlier, which is that that humans are flexible. That of course, in some environments, females would end up doing the hunting. But if I read his argument right, is to say that there is a lot of sexual division of labor in most hunter-gatherers, but that doesn't matter so much because he has done a lot of studies with the Batek people in Malaysia, and they are one of the most notoriously gender egalitarian hunter-gatherers. But the men do most of the hunting.
Mhm.
And so I think his point, and what about one really nice anecdote that really stuck with me is that he also says that, however, there are some girls who during adolescence get really into the blow dart hunting. And then they might stick to it after adolescence too. So there's no strict, oh, you shouldn't be hunting, which there is unfortunately in some hunter gatherers. But for example, there's no strict, this kind of division. But most importantly, the fact that they have a lot of egalitarianism, gender equality, isn't there because there will be this 50-50 division of labor about everything. No, they have sexual division of labor in percentages, not in absolutes, but they're still very egalitarian. And that should be the kind of more important take home message, is not to wrestle about whether there was sexual division of labor, but rather to see how, despite of it, or you can have gender egalitarianism, and how even with it, you can have gender inequality. That's kind of how I read his argument.
I have nothing against that argument at all, like, because I don't think that runs counter to what we were saying in our articles in any way, shape, or form.
No, it's not I would just say it's a different focus.
Yeah, and I'm fine with that focus. Our focus is just being much more objective coming into reconstructions of the past than we have been, so that we are not assuming that it is only males doing this and only females doing that. Therefore, you keep building those reconstructions and these deep sexual divisions of labor.
Yeah. I mean, he also did cite some evidence where you might actually disagree a little bit more. This was very much in the details, so it's not so central to the argument. But in that piece, and as I said, I really only remember this morning, oh my God, Vivek has written this. I should really check it out again. And I did go through it again. And I can quote from it, actually. He does say that, quote, this was supported. So in a recent review of women's hunting that surveyed traditional societies around the world, the authors found that pregnant or lactating women do not often hunt, and those with dependents only hunt when childcare is available or rich hunting grounds are close to the camp. It's not that you have in your articles with Sarah Lacey, you would conflict, but I do get the impression that what you're saying is that, that we put too much emphasis on child care being a restriction to hunting. I think it sounds like he's putting more emphasis on the fact that when you are taking care of children, you hunt less. And when you do hunt, you hunt in a more restricted area. What's your, kind of gut reaction to that?
My take on that, again, is I have no issue with it, actually, when it comes down to it. We do have evidence from the Agta that they are hunting while pregnant and fairly quickly after giving birth, and they will take babies with them hunting.
And the Agta, they are in the Philippines? Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, yeah, I don't have an issue with it. If an individual who is pregnant or lactating is not feeling up to hunting, then yeah, they're going to reduce it if it was a difficult pregnancy or difficult, child rearing. But again, we are a communal species. We communally raise our young, especially more so in the past than we do now. Now families are, my family lives in Michigan and I live here. Like you aren't near your aunts, uncles, cousins, and kids to help raise them.
Yeah. Which does put a lot of pressure on the romantic bonds.
I'm sure it does. But like one of the big things is we are one of the very few mammals who live such a long life, especially females, post-reproductively. Like menopause is it's not only a human thing, but we see it particularly in female humans.
Yeah, I had a whole episode with Kristen Hawkes about it. It was a fascinating one.
Yeah, exactly. Like grandmothers probably helped their daughters to be able to go and hunt because they took care of kids. If they wanted to go hunt, maybe they just wanted to go gather, whatever. Like, I don't have anything against what Vivek was saying, actually at all, because I don't think it runs counter to what we're saying.
Yeah, I do read it more as a complementary point. And so I did, I'm sorry if I presented it too much as an oppositional, but definitely, yeah, just different tone.
No, because people you aren't the one to do it. Yeah. Like other people have like, "Oh, what do you think about what Vivek says?" I'm like, "It's not actually that far from what we're saying."
Yeah, yeah. I just want to quote because this is such a beautiful ending. So I just want to quote again from his article. The final line was that, as the case with the Batek people shows, among a liberated society of equals, status and power has little to do with who brings in the meat.
Love it.
Yeah, that's just such. I love that ending. Um, but okay, I think we've done a pretty good job at dissecting the argument and hopefully avoiding unnecessary debates, understanding the nuances. So one more kind of very granular question is, I've heard that I've seen written that there is a correlation between sexual division of labor and habitat. So that in more resource abundant habitats, there tends to be more sexual division of labor and more harsh climate, less. I think that the very Arctic climates are an outlier in this one. But is that something that with Sarah Lacey, did you look at any of those kind?
We have not addressed that. No, we haven't. However, I'm working on a book and the book manuscript is due in January, so I'm having to put aside all other projects at this point. But Sarah and I are toying with an idea of another paper that looks a bit more at sexual division of labor when we see strong evidence for it and what that might mean.
Yeah. What's the book gonna be? Do you want to tell what it's the preliminary, the working title? Or?
It's right along the lines of this. So it is called That's What She Said, the story of Hugh Woman Evolution. And it's really highlighting the ways in which I think that the female of the human species and hominin lineage were likely big driving forces in our evolutionary path. Talking to Kristen Hawkes, you've heard that. I also am becoming more and more convinced that the innate human endurance that we seem to have, because we are one of the best endurance mammals on this planet, might actually come from physiology related to pregnancy.
Very interesting. Very interesting. This is probably an unfair question, and if you think it is, I'll leave it out from the final product. You get a time machine, you drop to 30,000 years ago in the Pleistocene. What's your prediction on the numbers? How many percentage of the meat is brought in by male?
Where are you dropping me? Where are you dropping me geographically?
Okay, very good. Well, give me a couple. Or no, that makes it more interesting.
It does. Am I in a very cold place?
Okay. Give me a cold place. Give me a savanna, and give me a warm forest.
So in a cold place, I would imagine, because we are again low plant like biomass relatively to a cold place or a warm place, I would say less sexual division of labor, because you're going to be smaller mammals and birds to hunt and fishing, things like that, but you're also likely going to go after some of the bigger things, and that might be an all hands on deck situation.
So that's the Neanderthal situation, right? Because they were in cold Europe.
Exactly. Yeah. Although Neanderthals were kind of everywhere. We like to focus on the European ones, but they're also our best fossil record. Like the European Neanderthal fossil record is much bigger than other locations. So in temperate, you might start to see more sexual division of labor. Maybe males are starting to focus on the big game hunting, and females would do fishing and gathering and things like that.
So this would be temperate, like
Indiana.
Indiana. Okay.
Although no one was here 30,000 years ago, but still.
yes. But okay. What about the classic savanna?
I would imagine the same thing, unless they are going for really big game hunting, in which you need all people to. I think it depends on the size of what you're focusing on. That if you're going for the big fauna, you're going to need more people to deal with that, not only of the actual hunting and killing, but then bringing everything back to wherever your central location is. And so I think it's not only going to be time and geographic dependent, but I think also, what your prey is, that's going to depend on, who's included in that and who is needed in that to make it happen.
So in the mammoth hunt, it would be more everybody, all hands on deck?
That's what I would imagine, yeah.
Okay. And in the savannah, I don't know, zebras or whatever is being hunted there, it would probably actually be more sexually.
That's still pretty big game. That's still pretty big game. Let me say this, I would not be surprised to see females on a zebra hunt.
Yes. But your hunch was that statistically it would be less common than with the mammoth hunts
Yeah, that's what I would
because
imagine.
there are many more very juicy plants as an alternative source. So you're diverse.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, now comes the unfair part of the question. Give me some percentages just to make it fun.
Oh my gosh, you're literally making me just make up numbers. Like,
Okay.
I would just be making it up, and I don't feel comfortable just making up numbers.
Okay. As I said, this is the unfair part. No, you don't need to do it, Don.
Then someone's gonna quote me on that, and I'm gonna be like, "No, I literally
Yes.
made that
Okay.
up."
Let's keep it down. But that was still like, it was a very, very useful, not numbers based answer. Thank you. Then a less unfair question. You get a time machine. You can go anywhere in the past. Where do you go?
Oh my goodness. I mean, there's the academic answer, and then there's like the personal answer of just like what I think would be cool. Like, I would love to go back in time to Neanderthals, like send me back to Neanderthal glacial Europe and seeing the interactions with anatomically modern humans. I want to see that go down. I think that'd be really cool.
How much do you think that the Homo sapiens takes over Europe by violent means?
I don't think by violence. I'm sure there was some violence here and there, just because people are jerks.
People can be jerks.
People can be jerks. Thank you. People can be jerks. There's going to be some violence.
Sorry, I'm an optimist, so I have to.
I'm a pessimist, so it's okay. So I'm sure there is violence, but we also have, like, we all carry Neanderthal DNA in us today. Some populations more than others. So, like, clearly we interbred. We didn't look different enough to be like, oh, nah.
Oh, unfortunately, of course, that can happen with violent means also.
It absolutely can happen with violent means.
I do think that the amount of trade and the amount of tools and things like that flows from population to the other, maybe, you loot a community and you get their tools, but it does feel more like there was trade and cultural learning.
No, I completely.
At least, but
I agree with that entirely. So yeah.
But was that the academic or the personal?
The academic one, because scientifically I'd be interested to see it. Personally, so as a child growing up, I was obsessed with ancient Egypt and the pharaohs. Okay. I would just love to go and see what life was like then. That's the personal fun answer.
Okay, that's fun. But that leads us actually into one of the final things I really wanted to ask, which is everyone who's interested in patriarchy. I mean, it's a big term and there's a lot of aspects, but let's just focus on the combination of a sexual division of labor, which is combined with the big power differences.
Mm-hmm.
So if we focus on that aspect of historic patriarchy, which is just unfortunately prevalent throughout written history. Some people have a very easy time explaining it because they say it's just biology. Of course, look at the baboons. That's just how we've been doing it all the time.
Take a look at bonobos and you can be like, no, that's not how it's done.
Yeah. So when do you think that it starts? Because this is one of the most there's actually 2 books on it this year, like high profile books, Patriarchs by Angela Saini and Why Men. Unfortunately, I can't remember the author's name now. By 2 anthropologists. I interviewed Richard Wrangham earlier, who is going to publish something big on it soon. Very different take than for example, Saini. But basically, I think almost all of these answers can be put on a kind of scale of from the baboons do it, we do it, all the way to, it was created by, I don't know, medieval Europeans and then spread by colonialism. Where on that spectrum do you think?
Yeah, this is a tough one. I feel like agriculture is where we start getting that deeper sexual division of labor, and I wouldn't be surprised to see more patriarchal behaviors coming about at that same time to reinforce that deep sexual division of labor, as well as the protection of resources and land and competition for land use and all of those things. It wouldn't surprise me, but that's also not a solid scientific answer. That is a personal hunch. I'm being very honest about what I'm saying.
what's your favorite logic about why agriculture? You mentioned the resource protection of resources. So would that suggest that because organized violence becomes more important and therefore upper body strength with wielding swords, or is that because you have a storage?
Yeah, there's the storage, and you are no longer following the resources from location to location based on seasonality. You are planting yourself and being sedentary, quote unquote, as in you're not picking up your settlement and moving all the time. And so you're protecting this land and protecting the resources to cultivate said land, that the stakes become much higher at that point of keeping a good plot rather than what you were doing before, which is following herds or following the seasons as whatever plant produces whatever food you are planning to eat.
And I mean, one of the arguments against that, for example, in Angela Saini's book, she takes a more recent beginning as the most likely, citing evidence from places from early, like am I pronouncing it, or the Catalhuik, anyway, in the Turkish, very old Turkish settlement, early agricultural community, where you, based on archaeology, at least based on some archaeologists, you basically find zero evidence of sexual differences in status, at least based on the grave findings. You do find it in ancient Egypt.
But that's the thing, is like it's so independent from location to location to location.
But there's also like 6,000 years between these, and I think that if I remember correctly, it's a long time. I read the book half a year ago or something. But if I remember right, the idea was kind of like that there is and I think also in The Dawn of Everything, David Graeber and David Wengrow make a big point about this. Like, we often talk about the agriculture revolution, whatever, 8,000 to 9,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, depending on where you look. And then we use evidence from things like ancient Egypt, which is more like, at very, very max, you find evidence like 5,000 years ago, anything interesting happening there. So there's like many millennia in the middle, which is just complete haze, and nobody even kind of tries to guess what's happening in there. And that actually that might be the most critical period for the emergence of patriarchy, according to some, like Angela Saini. But I don't.
I can't refute it in any way, as like those periods of time are just not mine.
Yeah, I'm just interested in your very academically educated hunch.
Yeah, my educated hunch is it is likely related to agriculture and having to guard what you have in a single location. You're not just up and moving to a new location with other resources. It is now you're here, you're stationary. And I think a really interesting question that someday somebody will responsibly answer is trying to connect, when is the actual realization that sex leads to pregnancy, leads to offspring? Like, when does that come about?
Interesting. Yeah.
Because, once males realize that, hey, this act leads to offspring and that offspring could be mine, that could change things too in the way, patriarchal structures come about.
Well, there are those lowland tribes in the Amazon basin who believe in shared paternity, which is, we talked about this with Helen Fisher. And I think she agreed to some extent. At least my take on it was that this might be one of the most useful misunderstandings in biology.
Yeah, in my mind means a lot more sexual freedom than what we see in other societies on the planet today. And so that they have a good way of managing, parental care that doesn't, get into interpersonal conflict. So yeah, shared parental rights sound like an awesome idea.
Yeah. I don't think I could retrain my mind to like it, but I think that if you're born into it, it might be a very nice idea.
Yeah.
Though they do have pair bonds, they do have marriages and things like that. It's just that it's okay to, to get some support to the pregnancy process from the outside.
Yeah.
Anyway, but yeah, now we are I've kept you for a while already. How many? Do we have time for 2 more questions?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, first question. It's been a little bit difficult. I've tried to stay clear about when we talk about male female versus men woman. The men woman discussion, I think, is more appropriate in anthropology, where people typically judge the socially perceived gender. Sex more appropriate in archaeology. Difficult things, pretty hot button issues nowadays. Without going too deep into it, I have heard you say that sex, like gender, is not a binary.
Mhm.
I think there are many people who don't understand what that would mean or don't see the evidence for the claim, and would associate it with someone talking from the social sciences or humanities who doesn't know about it. But you're a biological
Yeah.
anthropologist, so this is a wonderful opportunity to ask what is the meaning and what is the evidence for the claim that biological sex is not a binary.
So I actually have another Scientific American piece out that came out yesterday on this exact thing, that I co-wrote with Dr. Charles Roseman. And that I think we are approaching the issues of sex and gender a bit carelessly. And I think that the way in which we operationalize sex, and when I say the definition of sex here, I'll get to that in a moment, but the ways in which we operationalize sex need to depend on the questions we are asking. So there are going to be, so when I talk about sex as a strict binary, there are people like, you produce sperm, you produce eggs, you are one, you are the other. But there are people who don't produce either. There are people who have a testicle and an ovary. Like, these are still people who are part of the conversation. Like, you can't eliminate them because they don't fit within this particular box.
How big of a percent?
It's not a big percentage. Of course it's not a big percentage, but that still doesn't mean we can dehumanize them.
Sure, but I'm just to get a kind of ballpark.
It is a very small percentage. We could pull it up. But so, like, these are the things. There are people who want to do it by gametes, and, it's only this way or it's only this way. And then there are people who want to do it by chromosomes. But hey, there's recombination. So chunks of a Y chromosome can end up on an X chromosome, or vice versa. Or you can have XXY, or,
Okay.
like Fragile X syndrome. There are any number of things that allow for all this really cool variation. And then there are other things you talk about that we associate with a strict binary biological sex of, say, hormone levels. This is the most common one. And this is where I think a strict binary really fails us, is these characteristics that we associate with a specific, quote unquote, binary box sex, when really these are continuous variables. So things like hormone levels are continuous variables. And that's where it becomes really problematic. And so this was, mentioning it with like exercise physiology and studying females and looking at male-female differences and trying to relate it to testosterone. How about, instead of just male-female differences for now, we just look at testosterone and look at testosterone levels and correlate that to whatever performance variable you're trying to correlate it with. Using a strict binary doesn't actually tell you anything about testosterone in that case and how it affects performance.
But does it tell about something systemic? I mean, I could see there being a thing of, for example, testosterone affecting females on average different than males on average, where it's super useful to have that distinction, because it's not just about testosterone, it's about those.
And if that's the question you are asking, then sure, you can use a distinct difference.
Yeah. Okay.
And so we are limited in some ways by available data. So we talk about this in the piece, where if you're talking about evolutionary reproductive success, then yeah, we're going to talk about only the subset of the population, which is the larger subset, of course, that produces gametes and successfully produces offspring. That's going to be a stricter binary. But there are other ways to look about sex and the implications of what somebody's physiology and biology are, that these are continuous variables. These are not categorical variables. And that's where we need to be really careful about it. We see variation in chromosomes. We see variations in gamete production or non-production. And it all depends on the question you are asking and the ways in which you operationalize it.
Yeah. I mean, I think I could hear someone being uncomfortable with not the fact that there are, for example, intersex people. I mean, I think that's very, very important. Like you said, for not dehumanizing even a small fraction of society just because they happen to, because we want a simple category. But I do, you sometimes hear things like race and sex are social constructs that are more fluid than we have come to think. And that's where I would understand some people getting a little bit uncomfortable, because with race, you can really make a strong case that it is a completely meaningless biological category, and that's a very important thing. Whereas sex is almost mean, it is one of the most important biological categories.
Yeah, I'm not arguing that it's not.
Yeah. And so I think like that, what do you think of that? Like, would you share that person's concern about this skeptical voice's concern about using language which makes it sound like it's more like race? Because I think race is so easy to understand that, it's not a biologically interesting thing. We just started categorizing people based on some very superficial phenotypes versus sex, which is more underlying. Do you think that there's still like a very big difference that we should we should make it salient?
No, I absolutely think there is a difference. Like, I do not believe sex is culturally constructed the ways in which race is culturally constructed, because there are clear biological differences. But those clear biological differences, when I say clear, I'm actually glossing over the variation there as well. And so this is where the issue is that people want these very strict definitions, but so much of biology, whether human or otherwise, rarely fits in a strict definition without exceptions that give all sorts of interesting things. And no matter the ways in which we are defining sex, which there are multiple ways to do so, that should not dictate the ways in which we are treating people and the way we are legislating bodies. And this is where that issue really does, it's where the rubber meets the road, is that these people who are looking for very, very strict definitions, there are a lot of ulterior motives going on about, say, trans exclusion, or the ways in which we have transgender affirming care, things like that, which the US is facing so much of the legislation against those individuals that they are trying to find as strict of a definition as possible in order to push through this sorts of legislation. And the biology does not tell us how to treat people. And unfortunately, that's what's being allowed to happen right now.
Okay. Thank you for allowing that not so uncontroversial topic.
You saw what I wrote, Ilari. I have no issues with controversy. It is apparently where I'm living right now. So.
Okay. One final question. All of the research that we've been talking about, all the other research that you've done, how has it shaped your outlook on humanity?
I would honestly not say that it's research that it changes my outlook on humanity, but it's my teaching, and it's interacting with my students and seeing this next generation come up and seeing the ways in which they view the world and are actively trying to make it better. They give me hope. They give me so much more hope than anything I do otherwise within my professional career.
What about them?
They seem to be coming into things with far less stereotypical baggage, if you will, of like stereotypes about humans or gender roles or class roles and race roles. They seem to be coming in with a much more open mind without this more stringent view on who does what and why or what they should be doing. And they're very inquisitive. Like, they're willing to question things. And that gives me hope. That gives me real hope.
Dr. Cara Ocobock, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
So that was it today. Thank you as always for listening. If you enjoy the On Humans podcast but feel like you could learn even more from it, like you sometimes forget things and would like to get back to it, either just to check some highlights or to dig deeper in understanding how different ideas in these episodes link to one another, you have now more ways to do so. You can read the On Humans newsletter now on Substack, and this will give you a lot of nice extra content in a written format. As a Patreon member, you can also get a lot of useful extras, from episode prefaces to Zoom calls with me. But that's it for now. Until next time, take care.